Yorkshire, also known as Gildenlock in other places, and in today's video we're going to be going over every single unit in Battle Islands Commanders. Now, I did release a version of this approximately a year ago, but as you can see here, I very quickly have touched on some of the newer units that have been introduced, so I wanted to make another version of this video with all the new ones included as I go through it. I'm going to be going through it in the same order by theater, and assuming you've got some basic familiarity with the game, let's get to it. At the very start, we have got the rocket. It's a large area of effect damage, good for taking out large groups of infantry, good bang for your buck. Definitely consider playing with the rocket, especially for your early game play. We have the machine gun nest. It is the very first installation you will get a hold of. It only costs 3 points to put down. Basically, it adds a little bit of beef to the field. Obviously, since it's an installation, it doesn't really have any ability to add to your offense at all. But it's decent bang for your buck. It can, throw out some decent damage, absorb a decent amount of damage for what you spend. So, it's good for, stopping certain units that are easily distracted. So we'll be getting into the good counters as we go through this. So, and we've got the Rifleman, and as you can see here, this will be the very first infantry unit you get. It's a decent bang for your buck. You're spending 4 points on the field to put out 6 units. Not too shabby. But as you get into it, when you start reaching the higher levels, you might find that you prefer the auxiliary unit, which is just a better bang for your buck, I would say. But very basic thing early on. You should know at this point what it counters and what counters it, which is like the AOE type stuff I just mentioned. So moving on, we have the light tank. And this is it's a strong enough unit on its own. It deals decent damage, works okay against everything. Obviously, it would be weak against any kind of anti-tank stuff. But, it's a nice solid unit, and it's really meant for, I would say, combining with other units to be kind of even though it does decent damage itself, its strength really lies in being the meat shield for other units, such as, Mortar Man, or this Bazooka, which we'll get into in a minute, but there is the light tank for you. And here we have the Flamethrower, quite an interesting unit. It's a solid anti-infantry unit. It kind of fulfills the same function as the Mortar Man, but there's a little bit of difference. I really like this unit as a counter for certain stealth units that we're going to get into later. But it's very solid. Now, an interesting thing about the Flamethrower is that it's got a set damage on its explosion as it ranks up. So you can see the explosion damage is 100. That explosion damage stays 100 from rank 1 to rank 8. So you might think that as it gets higher level, it's not such a solid unit since the explosion damage doesn't rank up. But do keep in mind that an enemy that is hit by an explosion and not killed by it does suffer a stun effect as well. So if you're combining it with other units, and that stun effect gives your other units more time to blast things apart, really manages to, if you actually consider all that, it actually stays a solid, countering unit for infantry and good combination unit, pretty much for the entire game. Next, we have a Naval Gun. We've already done a kind of direct damage attack unit when we covered the rockets, but this is a little different. It does more damage, but it covers a smaller area. So it won't necessarily be good at taking out, say, those bigger waves, bigger clusters of enemies or installations, but when you have things tightly packed together, like you might with, say, if you have, say, one of those stronger individual 3-point units, like, say, a Flamethrower, Mortar Man, Bazooka, and they're tucked in behind something like this light tank, the Naval Gun's quite good for taking them out. So keep that in mind. It's good if someone's got some point generation tucked in behind tucked right next to a base. So the naval gun definitely has its strengths, but we're definitely going to be comparing that to the fighter, which is coming much later on, which does very high damage and can cover a wide area. But definitely the naval gun has its place, so be prepared to take a look at that. This is the medium tank, and it is a unit that it shares basically the same function as the heavy tank in that it is completely focused on taking out installations. I've seen I prefer the heavy tank overall, but I've seen players using this reasonably effectively way up into the higher levels, and we can it's very good for when you want to focus on pushing towards the enemy base and trying to take it out. Obviously this thing is going to need some kind of backup from your other units, so you've got to really think about unit combination with this. But reasonably solid unit in the medium tank. Next up is the Bazooka. It's, as you can guess, it's a bazooka launching unit, and it is very solid for taking out enemy tanks, but it needs cover, so definitely not the type of unit you want to throw it out on its own. But if you have a solid core of vehicles or something you can put behind it, Bazooka's a great unit that will cause devastating damage to enemy tanks and enemy bases if it's got very solid cover, and I still use the Bazooka. Next up, we have not what I consider the most solid unit. It's called the Halftrack, and it's basically an enemy that rushes towards the first enemy installation that it finds. But my main problem with it is it's basically doing the same job as the Jeep, only not as well. Now, when it does die, it does sort of do something a bit unique in that it spits out some infantry units. But in my experience, it's pretty rare for, once they've set up to take out your half-track, it's very rare they're not also set up to take out your infantry. So in my mind, generally not a worthwhile unit to deploy. It's interesting to watch it, but not one of my favorites. Moving on, we've got the Tank Destroyer, and I've been using this, probably one of the first epics units that most players will see, and it's quite solid, and I still enjoy using it. But it's really got a very specific place in combat. If you don't understand its exact uses and counters, it can be a problem either way. So we're going to be doing the what we've got to do with this thing. It's got to be deployed defensively, and it's a bit different from a lot of units with higher costs. But yes, you're really, to get the most bang out of your buck with thing, you got to deploy this defensively. Maybe throw that in there to stop an enemy heavy tank, something like that. Or you could just use it to effectively counter a light tank, any tank really. But the thing you need to understand with it is you don't want to use it the same way you use a heavy or medium tank, because it gets countered quite easily because of its slow turn rate and its vulnerability to all kinds of anti-tank stuff. So it's really got to be deployed effectively on defense and then comboed with other units to get the most out of it. And there's a whole bunch of counters for it as well, like light mines and auxiliaries that we'll go through as we go through this. And we've got the Rifleman Squad, not one of my more favorite units. And as you can see here, the reason for that is it's just, again, it's another example of a unit where you kind of overspent to get it. And it does put out a whole whack of units. Oh, actually, I think I had this wrong before. I think there was a mislisting on the Rifleman. So I think the Rifleman puts out 4, and this puts out 6, or I don't know. We'll check into that. But it's not really good bang for your buck with the Rifleman Squad, because you can spend 6 and they can counter it with 3. So not my... mind you, if you do combine it with an officer and it's not stopped, it could wipe out an enemy base hella fast, but still not my favorite unit. Alright, next up we've got the Mortar Man, and this will be one of those units that stays popular, all through, that I've seen stay fairly popular all through the career. Like the Bazooka, it's much more effective with cover, but it can kind of do a little more work on its own. It's very strong anti-group anti-infantry, but again, it is much more solid when it's got some cover. This is the attack dogs. It's just kind of a cheap distraction unit. Could be quite actually devastating against something like a tank destroyer that's not deployed properly. But yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Next up, we've got the barbed wire. This is it's a solid counter for enemy infantry if it's deployed properly. However, it's got a big vulnerability in that tanks can just run over it. So again, it could be a solid counter, but it is purely defensive, obviously. But against someone who's got a mixed group, it could be entirely worthless. So keep that in mind. We've got the Fortify unit, entirely defensive. It can fortify. It can add an important layer of protection to any installation or your bases. So good for countering, enemy attack runs with fighters and a lot of different, kind of single direct attacks like that. And it's even got a solid amount of extra health as well. So it's got a kind of unique feature where if there's like a single attack and it has like extra damage, it kind of blocks the extra damage. So for instance, if it got hit with like a huge, like say 500 point attack, all the spillover damage that is greater than this 255 is negated off that first attack. But it's a purely defensive unit, and it's popular among people who play a lot of sort of installation units because you really, to try and protect them. It's a solid counter, but it can make for very slow gameplay, so keep that in mind. This with the Barracks, it'll toss out, I don't really see this as popular at the higher levels, it'll toss out a handful of infantry every once in a while. You can see the numbers here. I'm not really a big fan of it because it just doesn't send out anything forceful enough by itself. But obviously there are still players who will use it, so I would, it's an interesting unit, but not one of my favorites. Let's see. Next up, we have one of the slightly newer units that was added. It's the motorized machine gunner. And I didn't quite like this unit when I first used it, but I did find it definitely has its place. It can be it's like a decent little chunk of HP bang for its buck. On its own, it's not typically going to do much, but it can occasionally serve as a solid counter for something. It's just this great Pangeran Broom, which we'll get into later. So. And so if you want it as if you want it as to counter units like that, definitely worthwhile. And it does combo somewhat decently with other units. And getting into it next, this is the APC. I'm not a big fan of this unit. I have seen it kind of used in some now if it does actually get off and it's not countered, it can actually start spawning endless amount of riflemen, and when it actually does work, it's really impressive. But that's kind of rare, purely because it's just I don't know. It just doesn't. I've never managed to see this thing really work for me. It's just countered way too easily, especially and it's very vulnerable to anti-tank stuff like anti-tank mines and stuff. So again, it will. If you've got some kind of crazy elaborate setup with other units protecting it, it could potentially spill out lots of riflemen that could make your enemy's life hack. And I've seen some people pull that off and just pull off crazy combos that push all the way to your boat really fast. But in general, it's just countered. It's just countered way too easily for me, and not necessarily one of my favorites. Now, where were we? This is the Officer. This is a very interesting unit. It's a pure support unit, so on its own, it's going to do pretty much nothing. But comboed with certain units, it can speed up their advance along their field and their attack rate. So this is a very interesting unit to use when you have a whole lot of units built up on your side, say defending, and then they're about to start pushing to offense. Because this will push them through the field very quickly and then have them hit very hard when they reach the enemy base. But of course, seeing as how it doesn't have a whole lot of HP itself, it's very vulnerable to people with AoE builds. So do keep that in mind. But I have the officer has launched a lot of devastating attacks, combination attacks for me during my time. And definitely, you need a little bit of finesse to use the officer. You want to kind of use it after you've maybe baited them into using their AoE on something else you have. So the officer can be quite devastating in certain situations, but very vulnerable to loss by AoE. Next up, we've got the medium bomber, and this is basically a direct damage. Basically, you get to deploy about 3 circles that are put down over the course of the map. It can do some very impressive collateral damage, so it could hit the enemy base, the enemy boat, the enemy installation, all at the same time for some decent damage. But keep in mind, obviously, it would be countered by, if they have very strong anti-aircraft units, it could be countered, or a lot of the damage could be negated if they throw up a fortify. So keep all of that in mind, and using 7 whole points does leave you very vulnerable. So you've got to have some good countering game, some good effective cheap countering game if you want to use this as well. But the medium bomber can occasionally be quite devastating, so it's difficult to use effectively, but can be interesting in the occasional situation. These are the rebels. Not a big fan of these. It's just they're just weak for what you point out. They're basically a distraction unit, but they're not quite good enough for distraction. Not quite bang for your buck as the doggies. Not quite as damaging as or as beefy as infantry. So I used them a little bit, when I was developing along the way, but don't really touch the rebels as much anymore. This is the fighter. I'm quite fond of the fighter. Again, it's a direct damage unit, but rather than hitting in a tiny little area, decently hard in a tiny little area like the Naval Gun, this unit hits very hard over a very long strip of the map, so very good for collateral damage for, say, the enemy base and the enemy troops as they start advancing past their own base. So yeah, very solid collateral damage, but unlike some of these other direct attacks, it is vulnerable to anti-aircraft units, so do keep that in mind as well. But yeah, very solid collateral damage unit here with the fighter. Next up, we've got the tank trap. You might think it works a little on the principles of the barbed wire, but this thing's not. There's no way to automatically run this thing over, which makes it quite a bit stronger. So it will cause a significant. The damage it causes on the enemy tanks isn't too crazy, but what's really strong about it is the slowdown time. So I think that even includes the turn radius on the tank destroyer. So if you're preparing a combined attack on enemy tank, this can definitely be a very solid addition to your mix. However, keep in mind it is vulnerable to AoE. Now, there's no unit that can target it directly, but if you happen to be throwing a bunch of stuff on top of this, enemy might get you with their AoE, or they might, if they've got like say those fighters we were just talking about. So very vulnerable to anything that's kind of area of effect or collateral damagey. But tank trap can be very solid combination unit to just demolish, say, an enemy heavy tank. Next up, we've got the A8 turret. Now, there's a lot of 3 or 4 different anti-aircraft units that all have its own perk. All have their own perks. This will take out. This does much more solid damage for anti-aircraft than say some of the other anti-aircraft units. As you can see, the secondary fire damage is only 42 on this other anti-aircraft unit, whereas this pure AA turret deals a much more solid damage per second on enemy aircraft. But the thing you've got to keep in mind with that is this unit gun can be distracted by infantry, whereas the anti-air gun on say another unit such as what was I was just at it. The A Halftrack is not distracted, but it's also the biplanes can be a little distracted by enemy units as well. So keep that in mind. But if you're finding you're spending your day facing a whole lot of aircraft, could be interesting to throw in the mix. And so that is the AA turret. Will target everything, and it will do quite devastating damage to enemy aircraft. This is the gun turret. I remember a phase of this game when it was very popular. Obviously, it could target pretty much anything, but it is a very devastating anti-tank unit. Obviously, purely defensive in nature, but you got to spend 5 points. But still, you'll get very solid bang for your buck if you're trying to stop enemy tanks. Wouldn't be quite as effective against something like a tank destroyer, which is just kind of beefy on its own, but still solid if you're mixing with other units. I overall prefer the tank destroyer as my choice of anti-tank, because I like something that can start out as, we'll just looking at the stats for comparison, can start out as decent anti-tank and then roll over. But a lot of people still love their gun turrets, so definitely a unit worth noting. This is the Jeep, and it's a unit that launches a very quick attack on the enemy base. It's not a very tanky vehicle, obviously, but it does hit quite hard. So I'd say it's very good bang for the buck on the Jeep, and combos decently as well. Very good for taking advantage of players who kind of maybe overspent their resources on one part of the field and they're just not ready to deal with an attack very quickly. But yeah, it's solid. It's solid. The Jeep. I think I've explained that well. This is the heavy tank. Obviously, it's the second most expensive unit in the game, so it's a very heavy investment of your points when you put it down. I could probably do it's one of those units I could do an entire video just on how to make it work properly. Like pretty much all tank units, it's really meant to be comboed. You've really got to have some kind of setup where you put cheap units in its vicinity to keep it covered as it advances. But what you get for your spending in terms of HP and damage is probably just a better overall ratio bang for your buck than, say, the medium tank. If it makes it all the way, it advances slowly, but if it makes it all the way to the enemy base, obviously quite devastating. So obviously vulnerable to anti-tank stuff, but it can take a lot more hits than pretty much any other tank in the game. And that's the heavy tank. This is the Paratroopers. It's an airplane unit, so it could be knocked out of the sky before reaching the enemy base. If it is knocked out of the sky, it only drops 2 infantry instead of 4, or 2 riflemen instead of 4. But it can occasionally be handy for sneaking into the back line with some units. But obviously, it kind of does announce itself. So people who kind of gives the enemy the opportunity to get some anti-infantry ready for the drops, and it'll be distracted hitting the base right away. So, not one of my favorites, but I have occasionally seen a player who can use the Paratroopers quite skillfully. This is the Self-Propelled Artillery unit. Again, not one of my favorites on the list, but it's a purely offensive unit. It advances. It kind of has. It's the only unit besides a sniper that kind of is sort of set up to hit the enemy base from a distance. So if it was left uncountered, it could theoretically just take out an enemy base by itself. But doesn't have much in the way of HP. So obviously you'd need to keep it covered somehow, which is a bit difficult. And does a little splash damage as well, but nothing crazy. And see, the damage per second is nothing too impressive, and it's countered quite easily. So not one of my favorites, but interesting little unit to play with. This is the absolute newest unit to be added to the game, the cruiser tank. Again, not one of my favorites. It's 5. It's kind of have trouble seeing how even though it functions quite differently than the Minesweeper, it just feels a little bit inferior to the Minesweeper in the role. So it's attack, again, not armor piercing. So, weak. I mean, so it's not going to be a solid anti-tank, and obviously it can clear out infantry very decently because it does have some AoE there, but it's so vulnerable to those anti-tank units that I feel like you're not getting good bang for your buck when you use it. This is the AT mine. Obviously, there's no little trooper when you put a mine. Basically, you just throw it up, spend a measly 2 points, throw down a mine. That it's a stealth unit, so your enemies do not see when you put this down. And if an enemy tank rolls over it, boom, wow, devastating damage, and could even take out a very expensive unit like the heavy tank all by itself. Or not the heavy tank, sorry. It would devastate the heavy tank. It would probably knock it down to half health, but the tank destroyer, or even the medium tank, would be very nearly done after getting hit by one of these. So very solid bang for your buck in terms of countering, but it can also end up taking out a much weaker or less relevant unit. So if you use this early on in your gameplay, the enemy might learn what you're up to and start countering you by just by sacrificing something cheap, like say an auxiliaries or something like that. So keep that in mind. Again, here's the other mine. It's the AP mine, and it's a cost of measly 1 point. I didn't really like this early on, but I've seen some players that can use this quite effectively. It's a nice little thing if you want to. One of the only units I can think of that can efficiently counter a sniper, since you could throw it down for 1 point, takes out their 2 point units, and can do decent damage to AoE clusters as well. So not bad, but it feels sometimes like it's kind of missing its place in the game to me. But again, here are the auxiliaries. And this is a unit, obviously we're going through this by theater, so this is a unit you'd unlock a bit later than your infantry. It's not very beefy, it's got 3 different types of units in it, each of which, and the rebels and the doggies don't have a whole lot of HP on them, so they're taken out quite easily. But it does deploy a whole bunch of units. I don't feel this is really saying that 3 units. That's definitely, I don't know what's up with the unit count. Oh wait, that's the attack dogs. So three attack dogs. Is that right? 3 attack dogs, 2 rebels, and 2 infantry. So that's 7 units in total for the low cost of 3. So it can be quite a good solid unit against it does hit quite hard though, so again, very vulnerable to AoE, but hits decently hard if it's not countered, and can be quite good for stopping units that do 1 attack at a time, like say the tank destroyer. And I definitely like it more than the infantry, but hyper vulnerable to AoE. But solid damage, so keep that in mind. Solid combo unit. Here we have the AA Halftrack, and looking at this, you might wonder why you'd ever touch a Jeep again. And I do quite like when I am up against certain players who are heavy on aircraft, kind of especially those medium aircraft use. I absolutely love the AA Halftrack. It's got it's got the gun in the back here that is fairly effective against those kind of enemy aircraft. So it could basically swat a fighter out of the sky as it's advancing toward the enemy base, and then do some pretty decent damage to the enemy base once it reaches it. So it can be a very effective unit depending on who you're up against. But keep in mind, this is the kind of game where you don't want to waste a single point. So if you happen to be up against those players who who never touch who never throw an aircraft, obviously the Jeep is a lot more effective, because you never want to have an inefficient unit in this game. But and those, like I mentioned earlier, those anti-aircraft gun at the back of the unit is pretty much never distracted by any unit. So this is this again. So keep in mind, 2 attacks, 1 for anti-aircraft, 1 for the enemy base. Absolutely none for any units that are around it. So obviously you'd want to very likely you'd want to keep this unit covered in some way, but very solid bang for your buck all around, and one of my preferred anti-aircraft units. This is the Howitzer. This is like one of those units I went through a little bit of a phase with. It's an installation, so it's a purely defensive unit, but it's got probably almost purely defensive unit. It's got one of the widest kind of attack areas of pretty much any installation I can think of that does attacks. So actually you could use it offensively. You could throw it right on the border, and it could actually launch attacks at whatever was closest to it, even including the enemy base. And I have had some interesting games where I used it offensively and pulled off a win at the end. But very, very vulnerable, and typically would throw this sort of in kind of midfield, slightly behind the line where my bases are, to kind of keep my bases covered from a lot of enemy, from enemy fire. I do feel there's a lot of interesting counters. Even the machine gun nest is kind of a bizarre counter for this, because you could throw a machine gun nest to serve as a distraction while you go in with something else. It's a bit bizarre. You kind of have to see that for yourself. But again, you don't see these infantry when it's placed on the field, but it's there. It'll keep you well covered from infantry, and it can be used defensively, but it just feels like a very vulnerable installation overall. So these are the biplanes. Obviously, a lot of aircraft unit were added slightly later in the game, and if it can be distracted sometimes, but if there's nothing in its way, it could be a very solid, for taking out enemy aircraft and then proceeding to throw up some extra damage as well. So, very solid unit for properly timed to counter some enemy fighters and then go in. And if it makes it over to the enemy base, it does throw down some very solid damage on the enemy base as well. But you could throw up a tank to distract it, like a light tank or something like that, to distract it and kind of, negate it a bit. Or you could just throw up some straight anti-aircraft to take it out, like the Halftrack we were talking about. So yeah, it's got an interesting place in the game, but occasionally countered or distracted very easily. This is the Minesweeper. It's a very unique unit in the game. This thing it does not target enemy units at all. So this thing can end up, if you place it right, can wipe out a whole lot of them. So you throw this thing down, it kind of meanders directly towards the first installation that it sees. It will switch and move towards newly placed installation if you put something near it. So for good or bad, you could throw up an installation to kind of just, in behind it to kind of distract it. But I really like this unit. It's a very solid unit to count. And again, it will pop enemy mines. It's just like the name says, the Minesweeper. So yeah, it can sweep away those mines that could be devastating towards some of your other vehicles. So it could be probably one of the only units I can think of that's like an interesting combo unit with, say, some of your other tanks and stuff, because it can keep them safe from those tank mines, etc. And as I mentioned, very solid anti-stealth. So if they happen to have one of those big cluster of stealth units in front of it, like the commandos, you think a commando's coming, you put it on the lane, it would completely run over those commandos, and you'd be spending 5 to knock out 5 and still proceed with a fairly effective push on the enemy base. Obviously, it can be vulnerable to anything that's not a mine. It's anti-tank, like, say, a tank destroyer, etc. But a very solid unit. It just obviously it doesn't. There's quite a few units that counter it, but there's quite a few units it counters very effectively and good damage on the enemy base. And an interesting unit to combo with the officer for sure. Here we have the Smoke. It's not one of my favorite units. I've seen some players that do some interesting things with it, though. It throws down a kind of area. The damage it throws down isn't crazy, but it does. It does. I don't really like the idea of slowing down enemies in their own zone, because that kind of gives them time to theoretically build up their own forces. But it could be an interesting combo if you've got some of your own units out. You want to debuff. It's really the only thing that directly I can think of debuffs the enemy units. So it's kind of like throwing down an anti-officer on the enemy units plus throwing down some effective damage. Could be interesting in some cases, because if you wanted some AoE and you had, say, a fortify at the end of its lifespan, it wouldn't be affected by that as much. But yeah, don't have a lot of experience with this unit, to be honest. But it's interesting. But I just feel like the drawback of how it could potentially affect the battlefield makes it not for me. This is a great Pangeran Broom. As you can see, it's an epic unit, the legendary unit. So not the one that necessarily everyone will have. One of the higher theaters. Very, very solid bang for its buck. So it rolls along the field. It does some decent. It has some semi-decent collateral damage, and it just hits very hard for 760 damage for 3 measly points at rank 2. Like I said, very solid bang for your buck, but could be more or less efficiently countered by throwing up something to kind of take the hit as a distraction, like put a light tank in its way, something like that. Then it's not going to reach its target, and it's not armor piercing, so can be countered. And you, like I said, the worst unit you could, if an enemy is using something, let's say the motorized machine gun, it could end up kind of lousy, because you could just have a cheap unit that could get in its way. But I feel like you've got a lot of options for direct damage. This thing can be taken out by AoE, although it takes a somewhat skilled player to take it out with AoE, because you got to get the timing right on that. But no units target it, and it does hit very, very hard if the little spin across the field thing does manage to connect with its target. Next up, we've got the Stormtroopers, and we're dealing with another legendary unit. I've seen people make some devastating combos with it, but this has got a very unique place in the game. It's probably one of the more devastating but combo units possibly imaginable. But this is a combo unit, and it's very, very weird place in the game to have a very high-priced combo unit like this. But that is essentially what it is, and as you can see, it's got 2 types of units. So it's got a couple units in the back that just, they're already semi-solid stats and everything. But the key part of it is the grenade stormtrooper in the back is more of a flashbang stormtrooper, honestly. And it's very interesting. The attack can stun all kinds of units, including bases and minesweepers. So very interesting counter for like a unit like, say, the Minesweeper. But it's just a little bit squishy without any kind of cover. So I have seen people do some very devastating things with these Stormtroopers, but you've definitely got to have some very clever combo tactics to make the Stormtroopers work. So definitely one of the more advanced units of the game. Motorcycles. I don't really know what to say about these guys. They're kind of a middle of the road unit. They move relatively fast, but they don't hit especially hard or have crazy HP. So kind of hard for me to feel like I know where their place on the battlefield is. I have seen people do some interesting things with combos on it, but it's not a unit that to me feels very outstanding. Next, we have the Commandos, and they're one of those units. They're one of only 4 stealth units in the game. So you throw this unit down. They launch they start marching relatively slowly across the battlefield, and they reveal themselves when there's an enemy unit or base in front of them. They hit very, very hard, but they're not beefy at all. So they're countered very easily by all kinds of AoE. So it's one of those situations where you're putting a somewhat higher cost unit onto the field that can be countered, very effectively, very easily. But it's if they're ready for them. So some players are really bad. Some players are really bad at knowing how to launch these things. Some players are really bad at knowing how to counter these things. So this is one of those player skill definitely affects how viable it is, but it'll always be weak to AoE type things. I definitely had a phase where I really enjoyed using the Commando unit. You've gotta be extra clever with these. But the thing that keeps me from using it is it's very hard to use. It is a unit to use it effectively. You have to use it unpredictably, where the enemies doesn't think to have some counters. I don't like it because that's the main thing is in order to use it effectively, you're kind of like splitting your damage. So if you're just working on trying to get down one enemy base and everything's going through one lane, it's not really gonna work out as if you're trying to rush to take out one enemy base. It could launch a devastating attack on the enemy's other base that you're not focusing on, but that might not be part of your overall game strategies, which is why I don't use commandos like crazy anymore. But some people can be really clever with these or taking these out. So very player-based skill unit, but not great for people who don't like splitting their damage. This is the war kennel. It's just, I don't know what to call it. This is just bizarre. It launches distraction units every once in a while, which are obviously only really going to be useful if you're comboing them with something. So I'm not a big fan of distraction units, let alone, repeating deploy distraction units. So this just doesn't have a place in my setup at all. I have seen some very unique setups that did some interesting things with it, but I don't know. How do you make this unit work? I have no idea. This is the sniper. It's not surprisingly, this is a fairly popular unit. For only 2 points, for a measly 2 points, it can be quite devastating. It's one of only two or three units that stop on the enemy line and continue to throw down damage on the enemy base from a long range where it might not necessarily be hit. As you can see, from the very low HP, very vulnerable to, everything, really. So any kind of you fart on this thing, it's dead, okay? But if it does not get farted on, it can do very decent damage, and I like it as a more effective distraction unit than anything else I can think of, I guess. Because you could throw down, say, that 2 point unit in a lane you're not actually genuinely interested in, and kind of force them to counter with an overpriced unit, while your main goal is just to kind of divert resources. But if it's not dealt with, it pretty much takes out enemy base by itself. So a solid little unit, the sniper. Just remember, its strength lies in making it a distraction. It really depends on what the enemy has. If they have something that can wipe it out no problem and go on to make a problem for you, then the sniper's not great. But if he just happens to not have any effective counters in his lineup, the sniper can be quite devastating. This is the garage, and this is I would say out of all the installations that deploy units, this is probably one of the more popular installations. Kind of earns its place. I mean, it throws out 3 light tanks over the course of the game, and if you're gonna have something that periodically launches a unit, by itself, I would definitely like it to be something like the light tank. So just think about this: you're spending 7, which is a lot. That's a big commitment on the field. But you're spending 7 points to put out something that would be 12. That would end up being 12 points over the course of the game. And yeah, so it's definitely one of the more solid installations in my mind. I'm not big on installations in general, but if I was going to go that route, this would definitely be the one that I would think about. And you definitely want to have a lineup of, that has units that that are very solid for comboing with your light tank, and some protection, like say this fortified, because it could be vulnerable to direct damage. But if you were going to make some kind of installation game plan, this would definitely need to be a part of it. Alright guys, I just need a quick... We're going to be going in... we're getting towards the end of this video. Quite a few of the units that only the more advanced players unlock. And I gotta just check a quick text here. But yeah, take a look at the stats on the dive bomber as I'm going through this. All right, there we go. So we're looking at the dive bomber. Now, again, this is not one of my favorite units in the lineup. I much prefer something like the fighter, because the fighter is very reliable, does collateral damage. This unit, not so much. Now, as you can see, it hits harder than the fighter. You can see it hits significantly harder than the fighter, but it's only going to be targeting that one installation that's in front of it. So it could be distracted by, it could be taken out with enemy anti-aircraft, it could be distracted with, say, a machine gun nest. Hence why I'm not a big fan of the dive bomber. But I have seen some players that can combo it effectively, but overall, not one of my favorites in the lineup. This is a machine gunner. It's a very solid unit, like all-around unit for just all kinds of. It's just a solid. He's just a solid all-around unit. He's one of the only cheaper units that's got armor piercing. That's like a really solid unit. It kind of has the same rule as the Bazooka, but not nearly as vulnerable, but not nearly as devastating either. So machine gunner definitely has its place if you're kind of this would be kind of a good unit if you were kind of feeling out the enemy the enemy units that were being used for the day, and you want something that's just kind of solid all around. Machine gunner is an interesting unit, but I prefer combos with specialists. But the machine gunner is a solid all around by itself to deploy a unit. All right, I guess I should I do this in the reverse order, because I think the blimps unlock last. I'm trying to do this a little bit by theater. No, I don't know. No, I'm going to do it this way. Because we're going to look at one of the newer units. This is the blimp, this is the Zeppelin, and costs really the same as the medium bomber, but let's look at how its mechanics are different. So this is a unit that I guess the greatest strength is if it actually made it all the way over to the enemy base, it could do some absolutely devastating damage, but it is countered very easily. So when this thing gets thrown down, there's like a little kind of grayish circle that you'll see underneath it. Any units that pass under it have a bomb dropped on their head. However, if the unit's moving quickly, that bomb might miss entirely. The blimp is not very smart about what it chooses to bomb. So if those units are locked in place in the middle of the field, the bomb could hit it and take them out. But a lot of the devastating damage of this could be lost to units passing under it. So that's a very key game mechanic with this to keep in mind, both for countering and deploying it. Also, if you put it in the top lane, when you're deploying it, definitely a lot of the stronger strategies, if you don't want it to suffer from distraction, would involve deploying it in such a way that it moves diagonally. This is just one of the later tactics I found out with it. but if you deploy it in the top lane, it could actually be you might only see the small circle. It might end up being off screen, so do keep that in mind. It does have some decent HP, so you'll need somewhat solid anti-air to take it out, but again, you could be spending 7 points and losing this to a 3-point unit like the if they had that anti-air turret like this one, or if they had some somewhat clever tactics with the A8 Halftrack and giving it a little bit of a delay in the field crossing. So we will be moving on. This is the flame tank. This is a unique in that this unit's texture got a rework about quite a few months into the development of the game. It's quite a cool looking tank, but fortunately it's got a little bit of a difficulty finding a place in my lineup. I just have trouble justifying taking this over something like the Minesweeper, which has a lot of these unique strengths. Like I said, it'll do very solid against enemy infantry, and when it dies, it's got that unique explosion that it does similar to the Flamethrower, only much more devastating. But it's just so vulnerable to, the anti-tank stuff that I just feel there's too much probability of it not giving you good bang for your buck. And this is the Ranger, and this is another legendary unit. This is a unit like I used to quite like, but I feel it kind of fell out of favor with me. So how this unit works is it goes on. It's quite a noisy unit. He kind of announces himself pretty hard. How it works is he starts his march across the field. The first unit, whatever it is, he comes across, he launches a grenade on it, which is very solid AoE attack, and then he follows it up with some machine gun fire, which is a very solid solid damage, similar like how the regular machine guns unit, which is just somewhat solid anti-tank damage. Oh, did they change that? That's how it used to be. Attack type. Maybe they changed that. I don't know. But anyway, so yeah, one of the things I like about it is that when you drop him down initially, you do get that initial grenade. But I just feel he's countered too easily by, say, a sniper unit, or sometimes the grenade, for whatever reason, it just doesn't quite go down the way I want it to. I can't, because you can't really control how he will hit the first unit in its way. It's one of those units that can be devastating, but it just doesn't always play the way you want it to. So that's the Ranger. We've got the Fighter Squadron up next. And it's a bit of an unwieldy mass AoE unit. There's 3 giant strips of damage that it launches across the field. So you might think, wow. So yeah, definitely solid for collateral damage. And you might think, wow, this thing launches 3 fighters instead of 1. Obviously, you're getting bigger bang for your buck. But again, I don't like splitting my damage. So that's what keeps me from really loving this in my lineup. But I have seen quite a few players that can be pretty, if they're kind of playing the long game and they just want to keep launching solid damage over the course of the game, and they're confident they can get at least their 1 base down by the first countdown. It can be pretty devastating over the course of a game. Obviously, it's got all the same counters as a fighter, but it's very hard to come up with a counter that can stop every single fighter unit as it's going across the field. But you are spending 6, which anytime you're spending over 5, you're leaving yourself a bit vulnerable, I think. So yeah, that is the Fighter Squadron. It's harder to deploy because you're not launching a single strip. You gotta get that placement just right to get the collateral damage correctly. So it's a bit unwieldy, but it's not one of my favorites, but it can be quite devastating collateral damage over the course of a game. Oh, why am I going to the bottom here? Blah, blah, blah. Next, we are looking at the tracked mine, and I don't like it. Bleh. There are some players that have found ways to use it effectively, but it just launches itself towards the first unit and explodes decently hard. It only costs 2 points, but I just feel way too often those 2 points can still be precious. I just feel like way too often this thing just ends up wasted. There are probably a few unique ways to use this that could give you good bang for your buck, but I just find this is like an all too often countered unit, the track mine, since it doesn't even it can be shot on the way to its target and do pretty much nothing. This is the Gurkhas. This is a stealth unit that you can only put in your own defensive zone and will stay there until something rolls over it. Because of that, obviously there's potential for it to be wasted, and it's a very beefy unit for what it's a somewhat beefy unit for what you put out. I mean, it's got a whole 5 units behind it with the 6 points. Still it hits very hard, but it just still feels a bit vulnerable to AoE, and it just as a whole 6 points. It's got a very weird place in your lineup. But if you really like playing around with stealth units, the Gurkha could be interesting to try. This is the comms tower. This is the only unit in the entire game that actually generates points. So it's got a very unique place in the game, but it's also very vulnerable as well. I have a hard time imagining ever using this without throwing in a fortify unit. So yeah, obviously it's got its a very interesting place. You see, if it lasts 60 seconds, and it gives you a point every 8 seconds, it's giving you more points than you spent if it lasts that entire duration on the field period. But my reason for not being the biggest fan of it is it's so unreal. If you're not using this thing with a fortify, so vulnerable to possibly having your points wasted. So for that reason, I'm not a big fan of it. And even if you do have a fortify build, that's 2 whole units. That's 2 units out of your 8-unit lineup that you've put towards trying to make this work, and then your whole unit flexibility has kind of gone down, and then you've maybe possibly lost some efficiency that way anyway. But there are people who are crazy about installation builds and just kind of overpowering you with raw efficiency that can make this thing work to their advantage. Typically, when I do see this thing work, I do see it in some kind of total installation build setup. But I'm not a crazy installation fan, but definitely an interesting unit, the comms tower. And we're finally, I'm so happy, we're getting towards the end of this. This is the Juggernaut. And to be perfectly blunt, it's not one of my favorite units either. But it's an interesting unit. Obviously, the most expensive unit in the game, so it is carrying out the same function as the heavy tank, but the question is it carrying it out as well? And my answer is not really, but it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting to look at. Obviously, it would do a lot better by itself than the heavy tank, but heavy tanks aren't really meant to be used by themselves. So as you can see, most likely, if you've even got some decent advancement, it's going to end up having less health than your heavy tank, and so definitely already got that questioning the efficiency as well, and nothing crazy different in the total damage total. What it's got going for it is it's got a secondary little turret that you can see on the top there that will throw down damage on enemy units. So yeah, if there's something like a little sniper on the way, something like, or some pesky little units on the way, it could wipe them out. But the damage it throws is not, like that secondary turret throws, is not crazy impressive. So so because of that, I don't really love what even losing that 1 point does to your, in terms of, you know, your total flexibility on the field. So yeah, the Juggernaut, not really a popular unit at the higher levels, but it can be kind of fun to watch this monster trudge along with its extra turret, but a little hard to justify taking it over the heavy tank at the moment. So there we go, guys. That is my video complete on every single unit in Battle Islands Commanders. This has been a long time coming, and I'm glad that I finally got this out there. And this could just be a great video for kind of triggering discussion. For, you know, people have questions about specific units that I somehow didn't manage to get into as I was trying to go over all these different units. They could, you know, reach out to me and say, hey, what do you think about this? Or some people might have some polite constructive criticism like, oh, well, you know, I actually know that you could do this is the unit. Who knows? But yeah, there it is. Try my full coverage of all 55 of Battle Islands Commanders units. And as I'm sure you know, welcome all your feedback. Hope this has been a huge help to you guys. And until next time, everybody, I shall see you starside.